The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning. After 43 years of paying rent without missing a single month, Marcus and Eleanor were being forced out in 30 days. The new landlord thought they were just two elderly people who wouldn't fight back. He was wrong. What he didn't know was that buried in their original lease was a single handwritten sentence that would change everything. This is the story of how three adopted children uncovered a secret that exposed a conspiracy and saved their parents' home. The envelope appeared under the door like a snake sliding through grass. Silent, unexpected, venomous. Eleanor saw it first, that Tuesday morning while Marcus was still sleeping. The return address made her stomach drop. Brennan Property Management, LLC. She carried it to the kitchen table, the same table where three children had eaten breakfast before school for decades. Her hands trembled as she tore the seal. The words blurred, then sharpened into focus. Notice to vacate. 30 days. Lease violations. "Marcus," she called, her voice cracking. He emerged from the bedroom, still in his robe, reading glasses perched on his nose. 78 years old, and he still moved, with the deliberate dignity of a man who'd carried mail through snowstorms and summer heat for 35 years. Eleanor handed him the paper without speaking. Marcus read slowly, his jaw tightening with each line. Around them, apartment 4B held its breath. The faded floral wallpaper Eleanor had chosen in 1985. The height marks on the doorframe tracking Jamal, Sophia, and Darius from toddlers to teenagers. The window overlooking the courtyard where neighbors used to gather before the building changed hands. "Violations," Marcus finally said, the word bitter in his mouth. "What violations?" Eleanor looked at the crumpled notice on the table, at the cold legal language that reduced 43 years to a problem requiring elimination. After all this time, she thought, after everything we've built here, the question that neither spoke aloud hung between them like smoke. Why now? Marcus and Eleanor Whitmore had signed their first lease for apartment 4B in March of 1982. Reagan was president. Gas cost $1.29. The neighborhood was different then. Working-class families, corner stores with owners who knew your name, kids playing stickball in the street. They were young then, 35 and 33. Newly married after a courthouse ceremony neither of their families attended. Marcus had just gotten his route with the Postal Service. Eleanor worked in the cafeteria at PS 147, serving lunch to hundreds of children who called her Miss Ellie and always asked for extra cornbread. The apartment wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, a bathroom where the pipes sang in winter. But it was theirs. The landlord, Mr. Kowalski, was a Polish immigrant with kind eyes and calloused hands. He'd survived the war and understood what it meant to start over. "You take care of my building," he'd told them, shaking Marcus's hand, "and it takes care of you." They'd kept that promise for 43 years. The children came later, not from Eleanor's body, which couldn't carry them, but from the foster system and adoption agencies that initially resisted placing children with an older black couple. Jamal arrived at 6 months old, all dimples and curiosity. Sophia came at 3, quiet and watchful. Darius was 5, angry and afraid, until Eleanor's patience and Marcus's steady presence convinced him that home could be safe. That apartment raised them. Jamal learned to walk on the hardwood floor. Marcus refinished himself. Sophia conducted science experiments at the kitchen table, filling the apartment with the smell of vinegar volcanoes. Darius's voice deepened in the smaller bedroom, where he'd practice speeches for debate team while his fathers listened through the wall. Now the children were grown and gone. Jamal, a paralegal in Brooklyn. Sophia, an investigative journalist in Queens. Darius, organizing communities in the Bronx. But they came home for Sunday dinners, for holidays, for the random Tuesday, when they just needed to sit in the kitchen where everything had once made sense. The neighborhood around them had transformed. The corner bodega became a craft coffee shop. The laundromat turned into a boutique. Longtime residents moved or were moved. Rent increases, building sales, evictions disguised as renovations. Marcus and Eleanor watched their community dissolve like sugar in hot water. 6 months ago, Mr. Kowalski's son sold the building. The new owner was Brennan Property Management, a company none of the tenants had heard of before the letters started arriving. First came notices about building improvements, then rent increases for everyone except Marcus and Eleanor, whose lease apparently protected them. Other tenants left, some voluntarily, some not. The building grew quieter, emptier. Marcus noticed the change most during his morning walks. Fewer familiar faces, more construction noise. Workers in hard hats examining the building's facade, pointing, taking notes. Eleanor tended her fire escape garden with increasing devotion, as if the tomatoes and herbs could anchor them to this place through root and stem. They'd felt the pressure building, but had told themselves they were safe. Their rent was always on time. They caused no trouble. They belonged here. The eviction notice proved they'd been wrong. Richard Brennan arrived for his inspection 3 days after the notice. He didn't knock so much as announce himself. 2 sharp raps, then the sound of keys jingling. Eleanor opened the door to find him already checking his watch, a man whose time was too valuable to waste on elderly tenants. He was tall, mid-40s, wearing a suit that cost more than their monthly rent. His smile was professional and empty. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, thank you for accommodating this inspection." Marcus stood from his chair, button-down shirt tucked in, posture military straight despite the arthritis in his spine. "We weren't aware we had a choice." Brennan's smile didn't flicker. He stepped inside, his shoes clicking against the floor Eleanor had mopped that morning. His eyes swept the apartment with the detached assessment of an appraiser examining merchandise. "Just a formality," he said, moving toward the kitchen. He opened a cabinet door, examined the hinge. "This is loose." "I can fix that," Marcus said. Brennan made a note on his phone. He pointed to a chip in the paint near the window. "Damage to the walls." "That's from when we moved the bookshelf," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I was going to touch it up." Another note. Eleanor moved toward the stove. "Can I offer you some tea? Coffee?" "No, thank you." He didn't look at her. He walked through their home like a health inspector in a failing restaurant, pointing out minor wear, normal aging, the inevitable marks of 43 years of living. The cabinet hinge Marcus had been meaning to tighten, the grout in the bathroom that needed recaulking, the bedroom door that stuck slightly in humid weather. When he returned to the living room, he stood by the window, backlit by afternoon sun, hands in his pockets. "You've had a good run here," he said, his tone suggesting their time was past tense. "But this building is being upgraded, renovated to meet modern standards. You understand?" "We maintain this apartment," Marcus said quietly. "We've never missed rent." "It's not about rent, Mr. Whitmore. It's about the building's future direction. You should be somewhere more suitable. Have you considered assisted living? There are some very nice facilities." "We don't need assistance," Eleanor said. "We need our home." Brennan's smile finally faded. He pulled a document from his briefcase, the formal eviction notice printed on thick legal paper. He placed it on their coffee table like a dinner check. "I'm sure you understand this isn't personal. It's business. The violations cited here, the loose fixtures, the wall damage, the general wear, they constitute breach of lease terms regarding property maintenance. You have 30 days to vacate. If you need recommendations for movers, my office can provide a list." He moved toward the door. Marcus and Eleanor stood frozen, watching this man dismantle their life with bureaucratic efficiency. At the threshold, Brennan turned back. "You've had 43 years here. That's more than most people get. Be grateful for that." The door closed behind him, Eleanor's hands began to shake, and this time they didn't stop. Marcus stared at the eviction notice on the table, at the legal language dressed up as concern for property standards and lease compliance. The racial subtext sat in the room like a third person, unspoken but undeniable. Somewhere more suitable, assisted living. You've had your time, but neither of them said it aloud. Eleanor walked to the bedroom. Marcus heard the door close softly, then the sound he'd been dreading. His wife crying, trying to muffle it in the pillows of the bed where they'd slept for 4 decades. Marcus picked up the eviction notice. His hands didn't shake. They'd learned stillness in a life where showing anger could be dangerous. But inside, something was breaking, or maybe, he thought, something was finally waking up. That evening, Marcus sat in his chair, the recliner with the worn armrest where his hand always rested, positioned to catch the last sunlight through the window. He'd sat in this chair to read bedtime stories, to watch his children grow, to wait for Eleanor after her late shifts at the school. Now he sat in it and stared at nothing. The apartment felt different, smaller somehow, as if Brennan's inspection had shrunk the walls. Or maybe it was just that the space no longer felt entirely theirs. The eviction notice had redrawn the boundaries. They were visitors now, guests overstaying their welcome. In the bedroom, Eleanor's crying had stopped, replaced by silence that worried Marcus more. He wanted to go to her, but didn't know what comfort he could offer. What do you say when someone threatens to take away the architecture of your entire life? Memory ambushed him. Jamal's first steps, right there by the couch. Eleanor kneeling with her arms open, Marcus ready to catch him if he fell. Sophia's science project, the one about plant growth, lined up on the kitchen windowsill. Darius learning to ride a bike in the courtyard below, looking up at their window for encouragement every time he passed. This wasn't just an apartment. It was the witness to everything that mattered. Marcus remembered his grandmother, who'd raised him in Alabama before he'd moved north. She'd lost her house during a flood, watched everything she owned float away in brown water. At the refugee center, while people wept around her, she'd said something he'd never forgotten. Home isn't walls, baby. It's where your people know your name. He'd believed that then. He'd carried it with him through life, through moves and changes, through the years of building this family in this space. But sitting here now, watching light fade from the window, he realized his grandmother had only told half the truth. Home wasn't just where people knew your name. It was where the walls themselves remembered you. Every laugh, every argument, every ordinary morning and extraordinary night. Losing these walls felt like losing memory itself. The bedroom door opened. Eleanor emerged, her eyes red but her spine straight. She'd changed into her house dress, the blue one with flowers. She'd pulled her hair back. She looked tired and fierce. "We're not leaving," she said. Marcus looked at his wife, this woman who'd chosen him when others wouldn't, who'd fought adoption agencies and skeptical social workers to build their family, who'd turned this modest apartment into something holy. "No," he agreed. "We're not." But neither of them knew how to fight this. Not yet. They called Jamal first. He arrived within the hour, still wearing his paralegal work clothes, his briefcase heavy with the weight of other people's legal troubles. Over coffee at the kitchen table, Eleanor told the story. Jamal listened the way he'd learned in law offices, taking notes, asking clarifying questions, his face carefully neutral even as anger simmered beneath. When she finished, he said, "Tell me about your lease." "The original one." Marcus and Eleanor exchanged glances. The lease? They hadn't thought about the actual document in years. It lived in the metal lockbox under their bed, alongside birth certificates and social security cards and other papers that mattered. Eleanor retrieved it while Jamal waited. She returned with a manila folder containing papers yellowed by time, the edges soft as fabric. The original lease was 3 pages, typed on a manual typewriter, dated March 15, 1982. Mr. Kowalski's signature at the bottom in blue ink, slightly shaky even then. But before Jamal could examine it, Marcus said, "You need to understand what that document meant." So he told the story Jamal had heard before, but never fully understood. In 1982, Marcus and Eleanor had been looking for an apartment for 6 months. Landlords saw their names on applications and suddenly remembered units were already rented. Others quoted prices twice what they'd advertised. One man had actually said, "I don't rent to your type," before closing the door in their faces. Mr. Kowalski was different. He'd interviewed them in his ground-floor apartment, surrounded by photographs of Warsaw before the war. He'd asked about their jobs, their plans, their dreams. Then he'd said something Marcus would never forget. "In my country, they decided who was human and who wasn't. They decided who could have homes and who couldn't. I didn't survive. That hell to become the same kind of man here. He'd offered them apartment 4B with terms that were unusual even. Then a locked rent rate that would increase only with inflation, not market rates. And something else. Something he'd added in handwritten ink to the bottom of page 3. Lifetime occupancy option with transfer rights upon original owner's death. You take care of this place like it's yours," Kowalski had said. "And one day, maybe it will be. But until then, you have my word. Nobody forces you out." They'd lived that promise for 43 years. When other tenants fought rent increases, Marcus and Eleanor's payments stayed steady. When the neighborhood gentrified, they remained stable. They'd assumed Kowalski's son would honor his father's agreement when he inherited the building. They'd assumed wrong. Now, sitting at the kitchen table with their son, they understood what was at stake. This wasn't just about housing. It was about whether promises meant anything, whether a handshake and a handwritten clause could stand against money and lawyers, and a system designed to erase people who'd been erased before. The adoption agencies had hesitated because of their age, because of their race, because the idea of an older black couple providing stability seemed suspicious to social workers who should have known better. But that apartment, solid and paid for and permanent, had been proof. It had given 3 children a foundation when the world wanted to doubt they deserved one. Jamal existed because of this apartment. So did Sophia and Darius. Their entire family was built on the promise that this place would hold them. If they lost it now, what did that say about everything they'd built? Eleanor voiced what Marcus was thinking. If we leave, it's not just our home. It's proof that they can always push us out, no matter how long we stay, no matter what we're promised. Jamal looked at his parents, these people who'd given him everything, who'd fought for him before he was old enough to fight for himself. "Then we don't leave," he said. "We fight." He pulled the lease toward him and began to read, and that's when he found it. Jamal read slowly, his paralegal training making him methodical. Page 1, Standard Terms. Page 2, Rent Schedule and Maintenance Obligations. Page 3, he stopped, read the paragraph again, then a third time, his pulse quickening. "Mom, Dad, look at this." He turned the document toward them, pointing to the handwritten edition at the bottom of page 3. The ink had faded to brown, the script elegant and old-fashioned. Lifetime occupancy option with transfer rights. Upon original owner's death. Binding upon all successive owners. Eleanor leaned closer. "We knew about the lifetime part. Mr. Kowalski told us that." "But this last part," Jamal said, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "Binding upon all successive owners. Do you understand what this means?" Marcus frowned. "That it transfers when the building is sold?" "Exactly. This isn't just a handshake agreement or a gentleman's promise. This is a legal covenant that runs with the property. When Kowalski's son sold the building to Brennan, this clause transferred automatically. Brennan doesn't just owe you a place to live. He's legally bound by a lifetime occupancy agreement. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Eleanor spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "So the eviction is potentially illegal," Jamal finished. "If this clause is valid and was properly transferred, Brennan can't evict you without violating your contractual rights." Marcus felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Hope, maybe, or something sharper. The possibility of justice. But Jamal's expression remained cautious. The question is whether Brennan knows about this clause. If he does, and he's trying to evict you anyway, then he's banking on us not knowing our rights, Eleanor said. On us being too old or too scared to fight. Jamal pulled out his phone, taking photos of each page of the lease. His mind was already working through the implications, the legal strategies, the potential defenses Brennan's lawyers would mount. "I need to research the case law around covenant transfers," he said, more to himself than to them. "And we need to find out if this clause was included in the sale documents when the building changed hands. If it was omitted, that's fraud. If it was included and Brennan ignored it, that's breach of contract." He looked up at his parents, and for a moment he wasn't a 35-year-old paralegal, but the 6-month-old baby who'd learned to trust that these people would protect him. "We're going to need a lawyer. A real one, not just me. Someone who specializes in housing law and covenant enforcement." Marcus placed his hand over Jamal's. "Can we win?" Jamal looked at the lease, at the faded handwriting of a man who'd survived a Holocaust, and decided that housing was a human right, not a commodity. "If this document is as solid as I think it is," he said slowly, "then yes, we can win." But even as he spoke, doubt crept in. Solid legal ground meant nothing if Brennan's lawyers could bury them in motions and delays. If they could drag the case out past 30 days, Marcus and Eleanor would be on the street before any judge could rule. Eleanor seemed to read his thoughts. What's he thinking right now? Brennan, Jamal considered. If he reviewed the sale documents carefully, he knows this clause exists. Which means he's betting we don't know about it, or that we won't have the resources to enforce it. He's counting on intimidation working. "And if we show him we know?" Marcus asked. "Then things get complicated fast." Jamal's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, frowned, then looked back at his parents. "I'm calling Sophia and Darius. They need to know about this." As Jamal stepped into the other room to make calls, Eleanor reached across the table and took Marcus's hand. The lease document lay between them, 3 pages of yellowed paper that had suddenly transformed from a forgotten promise into a weapon. 43 years, Eleanor said softly, and it all comes down to one handwritten sentence. Marcus traced the words with his finger. "Binding upon all successive owners." Mr. Kowalski had known, even then, that buildings change hands. He'd known that his word might not be enough, so he'd made it legal, permanent, unbreakable, or so he'd hoped. From the living room, Jamal's voice. "Sophia, listen. We found something. A clause in the original lease. If we're right, Brennan can't touch them." If we're right, Marcus thought. If the law meant what it said. If justice existed in more than theory. If they could prove that an elderly black couple's home mattered as much as a property developer's profit margin. Eleanor squeezed his hand. "We're not leaving," she said again, firmer this time. Marcus looked at his wife, then at the lease, then toward the living room where their son was building their defense. "No," he agreed. "We're not." But somewhere in the back of his mind, a question lingered. If Brennan knew about this clause and filed for eviction anyway, what else was he willing to do? The answer, they would soon discover, was worse than they imagined. Sophia arrived at Brennan's office on Friday morning, carrying a digital recorder and a notebook with the logo of a mid-sized online news outlet. She'd pitched the story to her editor as a human interest piece. Longtime residents facing displacement in a gentrifying neighborhood. Her editor, always hungry for content that generated clicks and outrage, had approved it immediately. Brennan's office occupied the 15th floor of a glass tower in Midtown. The reception area was all chrome and leather, the kind of space designed to intimidate anyone who couldn't afford it. The receptionist was polite, but cool. "Mr. Brennan can give you 15 minutes, Sophia smiled. "That should be enough." Brennan entered the conference room with the confidence of a man who'd been interviewed before and knew how to control the narrative. He shook her hand, gestured to a chair, and settled across from her with the ease of someone who'd never doubted his welcome anywhere. "So," he said, "a story about urban development. Always a hot topic." "About long-time tenants," Sophia corrected, her recorder visible on the table between them. "People who've lived in these neighborhoods for decades, watching everything change around them." "Progress is inevitable," Brennan said smoothly. "Cities evolve, buildings age. Sometimes change is necessary for everyone's benefit." Sophia took notes. Let him talk. He spoke about revitalization and bringing new energy to forgotten neighborhoods and creating housing that meets modern standards. The words were practiced, focus grouped, designed to sound progressive while describing displacement. After 10 minutes, Sophia shifted tactics. "Tell me about the building on Riverside. The one you acquired 6 months ago?" Brennan's smile didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "What about it?" "It's being renovated, I understand. Several long-time tenants have left. Voluntarily. We offered fair buyouts to those who wanted to relocate. And those who didn't want to relocate? We work with them. Find solutions that make sense for everyone." Sophia flipped through her notes, as if searching for a specific detail. "The building's previous owner was Mr. Kowalski. Polish immigrant, owned the building for nearly 50 years before his son inherited it." "Did you know Mr. Kowalski?" A pause. Brief but noticeable. "No, I bought the property from his son." Mr. Kowalski had a reputation for being fair to his tenants. Long-term leases, stable rents. Did that history factor into your acquisition? Brennan shifted in his chair. "I reviewed the property's financials and physical condition." "That's standard due diligence. Did you review the leases? The original lease agreements?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Everything relevant was reviewed by my legal team." "Everything relevant," Sophia repeated, writing it down. "So you're familiar with any special terms in those original leases? Occupancy agreements, transfer clauses, that sort of thing?" Now the flicker in his eyes became something harder. Recognition, then calculation. He leaned back, his posture shifting from relaxed to guarded. "Old contracts don't always transfer cleanly," he said carefully. "There are often clauses that seem binding, but aren't, legally speaking. Intent versus enforceability. That's why we have attorneys." "Of course. But if there were enforceable clauses, lifetime occupancy rights, for example, you'd be bound by those, correct?" Brennan's hand tightened around his coffee cup. "We've consulted extensively with our legal team. Everything we've done is within our rights as property owners." "So you did review every clause in the original leases?" "Everything relevant. And you determined that nothing in those leases prevented you from evicting longtime tenants?" The smile was gone now. Brennan stood, signaling the interview was over. "I think we're done here. If you have specific questions about any tenant situation, you'll need to direct those to our legal department." Sophia gathered her things slowly. "One last question. Are you familiar with a couple named Marcus and Eleanor Whitmore? They've lived in the building since 1982. Brennan's face was stone. "I don't discuss individual tenant matters with the press." "Of course. Thank you for your time." At the door, Sophia turned back. "For what it's worth, Mr. Brennan, people tend to remember the stories where the underdog wins. Those are the ones that go viral." She left him standing in the conference room, his reflection multiplied in the glass walls surrounding him. On the elevator down, Sophia reviewed her notes. Brennan had recognized the Whitmore's name. She'd seen it in his eyes, And he'd been evasive about the original leases, careful with his language. He knew about the clause. She was certain of it, which meant this wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. Jamal's phone rang at 11:47 p.m. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with interrupted sleep. "Mr. Whitmore?" An unfamiliar voice, female, professional. "This is Angela Chen from the city clerk's office. I'm calling because I processed some paperwork today that I thought you should know about." Jamal sat up, suddenly alert. "What paperwork?" "An emergency motion was filed at 4:15 this afternoon by a law firm representing Brennan Property Management. They're seeking to have a historical lease document declared invalid due to improper documentation and lack of proper transfer protocols." The room spun. Jamal's mind raced through the implications. "What lease document?" "The motion doesn't name you or your parents specifically, but it references a 1982 lease agreement with a lifetime occupancy clause. I remembered your name from when you pulled the building records yesterday, and I thought—" She hesitated. "I shouldn't be calling you, but I've seen too many elderly residents lose their homes over technicalities. The hearing is scheduled for Wednesday morning. That's 5 days from now." "5 days? That's not enough time to—" "I know. Emergency motions bypass normal scheduling." "I'm sorry." After she hung up, Jamal sat in the dark of his apartment, phone still in his hand, trying to process what he'd just learned. Brennan knew. Not only knew about the clause, but had moved immediately to neutralize it. The timeline was damning. Sophia's interview was Friday morning. The motion was filed Friday afternoon, less than 6 hours later. Which meant either Brennan had been monitoring Sophia's investigation, or someone had warned him, or Jamal's breath caught, or Brennan had already planned this move before Sophia's interview, had already identified the clause as a threat, and prepared legal action to eliminate it. Sophia's questions had simply accelerated his timeline. He called Sophia first, waking her up, then Darius. Then, after a long moment of hesitation, he called his parents. Marcus answered on the first ring. He hadn't been sleeping either. Jamal explained the situation, the motion, the hearing, the 5-day deadline. Marcus listened in silence. When Jamal finished, Marcus said simply, "What do we do?" "I don't know, Dad." The admission felt like failure. "We need a real attorney, someone who can argue in housing court and file a counter-motion. We need to prove the clause is valid, and that Brennan knew about it. And we need to do all of this in 5 days. Can we win?" The question again, the one Jamal couldn't answer honestly. "I don't know," he said again. In the apartment on Riverside, Marcus looked at the lease document on the coffee table, their shield now under legal attack. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her robe pulled tight, her face showing the weight of interrupted sleep and growing fear. "We're going to fight," Marcus said, not sure if he was talking to Jamal or Eleanor or himself. "Whatever it takes." But after he hung up, the silence in the apartment felt oppressive. The walls that had protected them for 43 years suddenly seemed thin, vulnerable. Eleanor sat beside him. "They're trying to erase us. Make it like we were never here." Marcus took her hand. "They can't. We exist. This family exists. We're not memories they can file away." But even as he spoke, doubt crept in. How many families had been erased before? How many homes had been declared invalid, inconvenient, in the way of progress? Outside, the city hummed with its indifferent nighttime rhythm. Inside apartment 4B, Marcus and Eleanor sat together in the dark, holding onto each other and the fragile hope that 5 days would be enough. The family gathered Saturday morning in apartment 4B, but the usual warmth felt fractured by tension and fear. Jamal spread documents across the kitchen table. The original lease, building records, property transfer papers. Sophia reviewed her interview notes. Darius paced, his community organizer instincts telling him they needed to mobilize, to make noise, to bring people into this fight. "We need public pressure," Darius argued, his voice rising. Fill the courtroom. Get media attention. Show them they can't just disappear people quietly. We need legal strategy, Jamal countered. This is going to be won or lost on the validity of that clause and whether proper transfer protocols were followed. Protests don't change property law. And I need to write this story, Sophia said. Get it out before the hearing. Let people know what's happening. That could backfire, Jamal warned. Make Brennan dig in harder. He's already dug in. At least this way people will know. Marcus listened to his children argue, each one fighting in the way they knew how, none of them entirely sure which path was right. He felt old suddenly, not just in years, but in relevance. This was a fight being waged in languages he didn't speak. Legal motions and media strategy and grassroots organizing. Eleanor sat silent at the table, her hands folded in her lap, watching the family she'd built fracture under pressure. Eventually, the arguments wound down into exhausted silence. Darius left first, frustrated and angry. Sophia followed, promising to find a housing attorney. Jamal stayed longest, going over the documents one more time, searching for something he might have missed. When he finally left, Marcus and Eleanor were alone in the apartment. The silence felt different now. Heavier. Marcus walked through the rooms, touching walls, stopping at the door frame where 3 sets of height marks climbed from toddler to teenager. Jamal, ages 1 through 18. Sophia, ages 3 through 18. Darius, ages 5 through 18. Physical proof that this place had raised them, held them, kept them safe while they grew. In the kitchen, Eleanor stared out the window at the fire escape garden. Some of her tomato plants were dying. She hadn't had the heart to water them since the eviction notice arrived. We did everything right, she said quietly. We paid rent. We maintained the apartment. We raised good children. We were good neighbors. Marcus came to stand beside her. I know. So why does it feel like none of that matters? He had no answer. That evening, other tenants avoided them in the hallway. Mrs. Chen from 3A, who'd lived in the building almost as long as they had, looked away when Eleanor said hello. The young couple in 2C, recent arrivals who'd seemed friendly, suddenly had somewhere urgent to be. Fear was contagious. Everyone understood that challenging Brennan could make them targets, too. Marcus and Eleanor ate dinner in silence. The food tasted like cardboard. The apartment felt simultaneously too large and too small, full of memories but empty of certainty. That night, unable to sleep, Marcus sat in his chair with the lease document in his lap. He traced Mr. Kowalski's signature with his finger, remembering the old man's accent, his kind eyes, his promise that nobody would force them out. I kept my word, Marcus whispered to the ghost of his old landlord. I took care of this place. I raised my family here with honor. I did everything you asked. The paper was silent in his hands. Eleanor found him there at 3 a.m., tears running down his face. The first time she'd seen him cry in years. We're losing it, he said. No matter what we do, we're losing it. She knelt beside his chair, taking his face in her hands. Then we lose it fighting. We lose it standing up. We don't lose it silent. The lease document lay between them, yellowed and fragile, a promise written in fading ink by a dead man. All they had left was faith that somewhere, somehow, justice still meant something. Outside, the city slept. Inside apartment 4B, Marcus and Eleanor held on to each other, and the thinning hope that 5 days would be enough to save everything they'd built. Sunday morning, Sophia made a phone call she'd been putting off. She found the number online, hesitated, then dialed. Hello? The voice was older, uncertain. Mr. Kowalski? Michael Kowalski? Yes. Who is this? Sophia identified herself, explained she was writing about the building his father had owned, about long-time tenants facing displacement. There was a long pause. I know who you're calling about. he said finally. "The Whitmores. You sold the building to Richard Brennan. 6 months ago." "I did." His voice carried. Shame she hadn't expected. "Did? You tell him about the lifetime occupancy clause in their lease?" Silence stretched so long Sophia thought he'd hung up. "Then, can we meet? I'd rather not do this over the phone." They met at a diner in Queens an hour later. Michael Kowalski was in his 60s, gray-haired, with his father's sad eyes. He ordered coffee he didn't drink. "My father loved that building," he began. "It wasn't just property to him. It was people. After what he survived in the war, he believed housing was a human right. He gave the Whitmores a lifetime occupancy agreement." Michael nodded. "He gave several longtime tenants special terms. The Whitmores, Mrs. Chen in 3A, 2 others who've since passed. He said people deserved stability, that you couldn't build a life if the ground kept shifting under you." "When you sold to Brennan, did you tell him about these agreements?" Michael's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "He knew. I showed him all the original leases during due diligence. He asked specifically about any special terms or clauses." Sophia's pulse quickened. "And what did he say?" "He said—" Michael's voice dropped. "He said it didn't matter. That there were legal ways around old clauses. That language like lifetime occupancy was too vague to be enforceable. He told me not to worry about it." "But you did worry." "Of course I worried. But he offered me—" Michael looked away. "He offered me an additional $50,000 to exclude those specific leases from the official sale records. To say they'd been lost or were never properly documented." The diner noise faded into background static. Sophia kept her voice steady. "You took the money." "God help me, I did. I told myself it wouldn't matter. That surely Brennan wouldn't actually evict elderly tenants. That maybe he'd honor my father's agreements even without the paperwork. But he didn't." "No." Michael's eyes were wet. "And now I can't sleep. I keep seeing my father's face. He survived Auschwitz. He came to this country with nothing and built something good. And I sold his promise for $50,000. Sophia's recorder was running. She had him. "Would you be willing to testify to this? In court?" Michael looked at her. And in that moment, Sophia saw a man trying to decide if redemption was possible. "If I do, Brennan's lawyers will destroy me. They'll say I'm lying to avoid returning the money. They'll make me look like an accomplice to fraud." Sophia finished gently. "Because that's what you were. I'm sorry to be blunt, but that's the truth." He flinched but didn't argue. "The question is," Sophia continued, "what kind of man do you want to be? Your father's son? Or the person who helped destroy his legacy?" Michael stared into his untouched coffee for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I'll testify. Tell me what I need to do." Meanwhile, Jamal had made progress of his own. Through a friend at his firm, he'd connected with Margaret Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen in 3A, a housing attorney with a reputation for fighting landlords and winning. She'd agreed to review the case pro bono after hearing the details. Sunday evening, she came to the apartment. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, wearing a blazer that had seen better days. She examined the lease document with the careful attention of someone who knew how cases were won and lost on small details. After 20 minutes, she looked up. "This is solid. The language is clear, the terms are specific, and the transfer clause is properly worded. If you can prove Brennan knew about it when he bought the building, we have a case." "Sophia has proof," Jamal said. "Kowalski's son will testify that Brennan paid him to hide the leases." Margaret's eyes widened. "That's fraud. Intentional fraud. If we can prove that in court." She didn't finish, but her smile said enough. Darius had been working his own angle. Sunday afternoon, he'd contacted every community organization, tenant rights group, and housing advocate he knew. By evening, he had commitments from 30 people to fill the courtroom Wednesday morning. "Judges notice when communities show up," he explained to his parents. "Even if they won't admit it matters, it matters." The family reconvened Sunday night, each bringing their piece of the strategy. Legal defense, public testimony, community pressure, media coverage. For the first time since the eviction notice arrived, the path forward felt clear. Marcus looked at his children, these three people who'd grown up in this apartment, who understood what it meant to fight for home because this place had taught them. "Thank you," he said simply. "For not giving up," Jamal smiled. "You never gave up on us. We're not giving up on you." Eleanor brought out food, leftovers transformed into a meal, the kind of magic she'd performed for years when money was tight and mouths were many. They ate together at the kitchen table, and for a little while the apartment felt like it used to, full of life and hope and family. Outside, night settled over the city. Inside, the Whitmore family prepared for war. Wednesday morning would bring the fight, but tonight they had each other and a plan. It would have to be enough. Wednesday morning arrived cold and bright. The courthouse steps were crowded with supporters Darius had mobilized, tenant advocates, community members, former neighbors who remembered Marcus and Eleanor from better days. They held signs. 43 years is a lifetime. Housing is a human right. Seniors deserve dignity. News cameras captured it all. Inside courtroom 4C, the atmosphere was dense with tension. Brennan sat with two attorneys in expensive suits, confident and composed. Marcus and Eleanor sat with Margaret Chen, Jamal beside them, Sophia in the gallery with her notepad. Michael Kowalski sat in the back, looking like a man preparing for confession. Judge Morrison entered, a black woman in her 60s with silver hair and an expression that suggested she'd heard every lie lawyers could tell. She took her seat, surveyed the crowded courtroom, and called the hearing to order. "This is an emergency motion filed by Brennan Property Management seeking to invalidate a 1982 lease agreement with Marcus and Eleanor Whitmore. Counselors, we have limited time. Make your arguments count." Brennan's lead attorney, a man named Douglas Harrison, stood. Tall, silver-haired, voice smooth as oil. "Your Honor, the lease in question contains a handwritten clause added by the previous property owner. A clause that was never properly documented, never filed with the property records, and never intended to survive the transfer of ownership. The language is vague, the intent is unclear, and the attempt to enforce it 43 years later is both impractical and legally unsound." He gestured dismissively at the document. "My client purchased this property in good faith, reviewed all official records, and found no indication of any lifetime occupancy agreement. To now claim such an agreement exists, based on a handwritten note in faded ink, is an attempt to manufacture rights that don't legally exist." He sat down, satisfied. Margaret Chen rose. She was half Harrison's size, but twice his presence. "Your Honor, the lease is clear. Page 3, paragraph 7. Handwritten by the property owner and initialed by both parties. The language is not vague. It explicitly states, lifetime occupancy option with transfer rights upon original owner's death, binding upon all successive owners." The intent could not be clearer. She held up the document. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore have honored every term of this lease for 43 years. They've paid rent without fail. They've maintained the property. They've been model tenants. The only party failing to honor this agreement is the defendant." Harrison stood to object. "The document was never properly filed." "Because it didn't need to be," Margaret cut him off. "This is a private covenant between landlord and tenant, properly executed and signed. Property law doesn't require filing for such agreements to be valid." Judge Morrison leaned forward. "Counselor Harrison, did your client review the original leases during due diligence?" Harrison hesitated. "The official records were reviewed. That's not what I asked." "Did he review the original lease agreements held by the tenants?" "Your Honor, standard practice is to review filed documents." "Again, not what I asked." Judge Morrison's voice sharpened. "Yes or no? Did Richard Brennan see this lease before purchasing the property? Harrison consulted with Brennan in whispered conference. Finally, we'd need to review acquisition records to Ms. Chen? Judge Morrison turned. Do you have evidence on this point? We do, Your Honor. We call Michael Kowalski to testify. A ripple went through the courtroom. Harrison's face went pale. Michael Kowalski walked to the witness stand like a man approaching gallows. He was sworn in, sat down, gripped the armrests. Margaret approached gently. Mr. Kowalski, you sold the building in question to Richard Brennan 6 months ago? Yes. During the sale process, did Mr. Brennan ask to review the original tenant leases? He did. And did you show him the Whitmore's lease, including the lifetime occupancy clause? Michael's voice cracked. Yes, I showed him everything. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Morrison gavelled for silence. What was Mr. Brennan's response? Margaret asked. He said. Michael paused, gathered courage. He said the clause didn't matter, that there were legal ways around old agreements. That lifetime occupancy language was too vague to enforce. Did he offer you any incentive to handle this lease differently? Harrison shot to his feet. Objection! Speculation, and he offered me $50,000, Michael said, his voice suddenly loud, clear. $50,000 to exclude the original leases from the official sale records, to say they'd been lost, to make it look like they never existed. The courtroom exploded. Judge Morrison gavelled hard. Order! Harrison was on his feet, objecting, demanding the testimony be stricken. Brennan sat frozen, his face ashen. Margaret let the chaos settle, then asked her final question. Mr. Kowalski, why did you take the money? Michael looked at Marcus and Eleanor, tears streaming down his face. Because I was weak. Because I convinced myself it wouldn't matter. Because I betrayed my father's legacy and these people's trust. His voice broke. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Margaret returned to her table. No further questions. Harrison tried to cross-examine, to discredit Michael's testimony, to suggest he was lying to avoid returning the money. But Michael's grief was too raw, too genuine. Even Harrison's practiced skepticism couldn't make it seem false. Judge Morrison called a brief recess. When she returned, her expression was granite. Mr. Brennan, please stand. Brennan rose, his lawyers flanking him. Did you have knowledge of the lifetime occupancy clause in the Whitmore's lease before filing for eviction? Brennan's lawyer whispered urgently. Brennan's jaw worked. Finally, I was advised the clause was unenforceable. That wasn't my question. Judge Morrison's voice could have cut steel. Did you have knowledge of the clause? Silence stretched. Then, barely audible, yes. The judge's expression didn't change, but something cold entered her eyes. Attempting to evict tenants while knowingly suppressing a valid lease agreement isn't just unethical, it's fraudulent. The motion to invalidate the lease is denied. The lifetime occupancy clause is valid and enforceable. The eviction notice is hereby voided. She turned to Margaret. Counselor Chen, I suggest your clients consider filing a countersuit for harassment, emotional distress, and fraud. And I'm referring this matter to the district attorney for investigation into Mr. Brennan's business practices. The gavel came down like thunder. The courtroom erupted in applause. Eleanor collapsed into Marcus's arms, sobbing. Jamal hugged them both. Sophia was already typing on her phone, her article updating in real time. Darius pumped his fist, the community members around him cheering. Brennan and his lawyers left quickly, surrounded by cameras and shouted questions. Michael Kowalski approached the Whitmores, his face streaked with tears. I'm sorry, he said again. I know it's not enough, but Marcus, surprising everyone, including himself, extended his hand. Your father was a good man. Today, you honored him. Michael took his hand, gripping it like a lifeline. Outside, on the courthouse steps, Marcus and Eleanor stood surrounded by supporters, cameras, their children. The morning sun was bright and warm. Eleanor laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. They were going home, to apartment 4B, where they belonged. The weeks following the hearing brought changes that rippled wider than anyone anticipated. Sophia's article, How a Property Developer Tried to Erase an Elderly Couple's 43-Year Home, went viral. It was shared tens of thousands of times, picked up by national outlets, discussed on morning shows. The district attorney's office launched a formal investigation into Brennan property management. Dozens of former tenants came forward with similar stories of pressure, intimidation, and suspicious eviction attempts. 3 other buildings Brennan owned were found to have original leases with special clauses that had been lost during acquisition. Brennan resigned from his company. His business partners issued a statement about reviewing internal practices and committing to tenant rights. It was too little, too late. But it was something. Marcus and Eleanor returned to apartment 4B to find neighbors suddenly willing to make eye contact again. Mrs. Chen from 3A brought over soup. The young couple in 2C apologized for their earlier coldness. The building, emptied by fear, began to refill with life. The apartment felt different now, not changed, but clarified. Every room, every wall, every worn floorboard carried weight they'd almost lost. Walking through it felt like touching something holy. Sunday dinner became sacred again. Jamal brought his daughter, 4 years old, curious, full of questions. She asked why everyone was so happy, why Grandma Eleanor kept crying even though she was smiling. Eleanor knelt down to her level. Because sometimes you have to fight for what's right, sweetheart. And sometimes, if you're lucky and brave, you win. The little girl considered this seriously. Did you win, Grandma? Yes, baby. We won. Marcus took the original lease document, now laminated and protected by the court, and hung it on the living room wall. Not hidden in a lockbox anymore, but displayed. A reminder. A testament. Proof that promises could still mean something. Darius used the case as a springboard, founding a tenant rights organization that helped other elderly residents fight wrongful evictions. In the first month, they saved 3 families from displacement. Sophia won a journalism award for her coverage. In her acceptance speech, she said, "My parents taught me that home isn't just shelter. It's where your history lives. And some stories are worth fighting for." Jamal was offered a position at Margaret Chen's firm. He accepted. "I want to do this full-time," he told his parents. "Help people fight for their homes, because of what you taught me." 6 months after the hearing on a warm Sunday afternoon, the family gathered in apartment 4B. 3 generations now, Marcus and Eleanor. Their 3 children, 2 grandchildren. The apartment that had once seemed too small somehow held them all. They ate Eleanor's cooking, told old stories, laughed at worn jokes. Jamal's daughter asked to see the marks on the doorframe, the ones tracking her father's growth. Marcus lifted her up so she could touch them. "That's how tall Daddy was when he was your age," Eleanor explained. "Can we make marks for me?" the little girl asked. Eleanor looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the doorframe, the history written there in pencil and hope. "Yes," he said. "Yes, we can." He got a pencil. The little girl stood against the frame, straight and proud. Marcus made a small mark, wrote her name and the date. The 4th generation, claiming their place in this home. Outside, the city moved at its endless pace. Inside apartment 4B, the Whitmore family existed in a moment outside time. Safe, together, home. Eleanor stood at the window, looking out at her fire escape garden. She'd replanted everything after the hearing. The tomatoes were thriving now, bright red against green leaves. Marcus came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers with the ease of 43 years of practice. "We did it," she said softly. "We did? You think Mr. Kowalski knows?" Marcus considered. "I think he knows. and I think he's proud." They stood together in the golden afternoon light, watching their family fill the space they'd fought so hard to keep. The apartment felt like it always had. Worn but loved, modest but enough, permanent in the way that mattered most. Home. The camera pulls back slowly from the window of apartment 4B, past the fire escape where tomatoes grow in defiance of concrete and steel, up the brick facade of a building that almost erased its history, into the vast sky above the city. Voiceover, Sophia's words, from the final paragraph of her article, spoken softly over the image. For 43 years, they were invisible to the people who owned the building. Just rent checks and lease renewals, predictable and easy to ignore. But when someone tried to erase them, their family refused silence. This story isn't about a lease or a courtroom or even a victory. It's about the generations who build homes in spaces that were never meant to welcome them, and the children who fight to keep those spaces sacred. Cut to Marcus and Eleanor on the couch, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. The lease document hangs on the wall behind them. No longer hidden, no longer just paper, but testament. Eleanor speaks, her voice carrying both weariness and strength. "They thought we were just old, and in the way. Easy to remove, easy to forget." She looks at her family. "But we had something they didn't. We had people who loved us enough to fight." Jamal adds quietly, "You taught us that home is worth fighting for, Sophia." That promises should mean something, Darius, that nobody has the right to erase you. Marcus looks at each of them. These 3 lives, built on the foundation of apartment 4B, now building foundations of their own. "Your grandmother used to say, 'Home isn't walls,'" he tells his grandchildren. "It's where your people know your name." And you know what? She was right. He gestures around the apartment. But these walls remember us too. Every laugh, every tear, every ordinary moment that made us who we are. That's worth protecting. The camera holds on the family portrait. 3 generations. 4, if you count Mr. Kowalski's spirit woven through it all, proof that one man's promise 43 years ago still echoes. Final shot. The lease document on the wall, its yellowed paper and faded ink visible. The lifetime occupancy clause clear despite the years. Kowalski's signature. Marcus and Eleanor's signatures beneath it. A promise kept, fade to black. Text on screen. Richard Brennan is under federal investigation for fraud and tenant harassment. Marcus and Eleanor Whitmore still live in apartment 4B. The lease is valid in perpetuity.